Hello and welcome back to the shit show. You know how it is.
You're not the boss of me now. You're not the boss of me now. You're not the.
Don't forget to subscribe to oh my god. Make sure you subscribe to Scrubworks, and also if you have to try and say that at home yourself, it is a bit of a tongue twister, so good luck.
You heard the lady. Following straight on from the last video where I installed the Marina pedal box, we're now going to be sorting out this mess, the electrical spaghetti. So the first thing we're going to be doing, or at least one of the main things, is replacing this redundant old voltage regulator with a modern sort of junction box, which will also incorporate a modern fuse box which can replace the original 2-fuse system, which I've already removed, and will have a lot of nice modern plastic bladed fuses to go in instead. Along with that, I'm also going to be tidying up the wiring loom, because it should be covered, all this, in this sort of braided material, but as you can see, after 50 odd years, it's just, yeah, it's dead. Also, amongst the electrical work, we're going to be installing this, which is a off-the-shelf cheap electrical washer kit, which will replace the old sort of super soaker pumpy thing that the car originally comes with. So that will be a lot better, and that'll be a nice quick cheap install. We're also going to be extending this part of the loom, which I had to cut from here to make the wiring fit around the pedal box. So we're rerouting this and then joining it properly so that the wiring is all neatly tucked away and not spread out all over the place like it is at the moment. So that will look like a nice clean install. One of the final things we're going to be doing is actually inside the car, which is replacing the original key barrel with an aftermarket replacement that includes an accessory position, which will then give us a little bit more flexibility in the future if I want to install another accessory like a radio or something. To convert the Morris over to a more modern fuse box arrangement, I'm going to be using this system here. This is a modular aftermarket fuse box arrangement, and it's made by a company called MTA. And the way it works is you've got the actual fuse box plate here, which takes modules. Now this one obviously has space for 4 modules, and it has feet that allow you to attach it to a surface. You then buy the appropriately sized cover that clips on, and then you can choose the modules that you put in your fuse box. There's several different ones you can choose from for all different applications. I've chosen these two. This one has space for a large relay and then 10 mini blade fuses, so this will be the crucial part in converting over the new fuses from the old glass fuse system. And then this other module has space for another large relay and then a mini relay down there. And these are the 2 modules I'm going to be using. And now you may be thinking, well, you've got space for 4 modules there, why did you then only buy 2? Because I'm going to use this, which is a little bus bar, and that's going to sit, if I can just rearrange it here, that's going to sit like that inside. It's going to need a trim, and that's going to house all my connections to actually go from the fuse box back to the main sort of electrical grid of the car. And the fuse box itself has these little cutouts in either end to allow wires to go in and out. And it's very simple the way it works. You just get your module like so, and then you do it with one hand. It's a bit tricky, but you just slide it in from underneath, and then it will just click into position like that. So that's now held in. And so these two are going to live side by side, and then the bus bar is going to live like that. And then of course the lid will come on top and clip down in the appropriate way, well, once it's actually inserted properly. And this is quite a nice compact system, which is the main reason why I didn't go for simply grabbing a fuse box out of a modern car and just sort of retrofitting that. It's because they're quite bulky, whereas this needs to be compact because it's going to live up on the bulkhead of the car where the old voltage regulator lived. So this should just about fit. It is going to be tight, and we're going to have to position it correctly so it doesn't interfere with the bonnet or anything, but this should work very nice and tidily. Okay, so since this is a video dealing with wiring, I'm going to have to talk a little bit about some diagrams here. I'm going to try and get through this as straightforward and as painless as possible. So here we go. This is the main part of Morris Minor wiring diagram that I got off the internet, and I've redrawn it a little bit to make it easier to read. So you see, the first bit I want to draw your attention to is the dynamo up here. So this is the factory system, and you will have two wires here, a green and brown and a yellow and brown one going between the dynamo and the control box, and those are used to, the control box is actually used to regulate the voltage externally from the dynamo, whereas an alternator has its own internal regulation. And then you've got another yellow and brown wire going to the ignition light, feeding around here to the ignition switch, which is what, you know, goes red if no voltage is being generated. So if we now skip forward to this diagram, which I've edited slightly, this is what the Morris Minor wiring is if you have an alternator. So now we now have an alternator instead of the old dynamo, and because it's regulated internally, the power from the alternator, instead of going to the control box, it goes directly to the positive battery post on the starter solenoid, from where it can feed the rest of the car. And then the alternator has its own separate little terminal which goes to the ignition light to denote charging, which is marked here with a blue wire, because that's what I have in my car. Now the main bit we're going to be changing of the wiring is down here, the fuse box. You can see that from the control box the wires feed the majority of the power of the car, which comes in through this brown wire. It then goes out again down to the fuse box. It then also goes to the ignition switch, and then it goes to a bunch of other things which are not fused, like the light switch. See, that takes power directly from the control box, and then you've got your dip switch for high and low beam, you've got your side lights and number plate lights, and the internal illuminations, which are controlled through this fuse here, a little fuse which is mounted in line, and there's a little switch under the dashboard for turning the speedo lights on and off. A lot of people don't even know that's there, but it is. And you can see that also the fuse box down here, the other side of it, which is the ignition feed, gets power from the ignition switch when it's turned on, and that feeds things like the fuel gauge and the wipers and stuff. There's also a feed here from the top of the fuse box, which is unfused, to the fuel pump and the ignition coil. So that's when the ignition system comes on. So what I'm going to do on my car is I'm going to basically delete the control box completely and the fuse box and replace them with a sort of all-in-one unit, which cuts down on the amount of wiring and makes everything a bit simpler. So you can see how I've cut out the components that are not going to be used. So if we now move to the final wiring diagram, which is this one, now you see it's perhaps a little bit confusing, but I've redrawn it. So what happens is the power comes in from the alternator, as usual, goes to the solenoid. The ignition switch then feeds no, my bad. It then feeds power through the original brown wire into a bus bar, which is basically like a sort of electricity jumping off point, which has 3 terminals on it, which I've marked P, A and I. P for permanent, so that's always live whenever the battery is plugged in, even when the car's switched off. Accessory, which is going to be a new accessory type circuit that we're going to add in, which wasn't present on the original car. And I for ignition, so that's what comes live when the actual ignition key is turned to the on position. So that takes so each of those terminals takes electricity in, and then will feed it to the fuse box, which also has 3 separate categories of fuses, again permanent, accessory and ignition. But if you look over here on the light switch part of the wiring diagram, you can see that the switch for the side lights, the fuse for the side lights has been deleted. Also the switch for the speedo illuminations has been deleted. Now the speedo illumination switch, that didn't need to be deleted, but my switch had actually broken, so it wasn't actually working anymore, so I just decided to get rid of it since it's not very useful. And I've cut out the inline fuse for the side lights, and instead all the lights, all the headlights and things are now fused directly from the fuse box on the permanent side. You may not wish to do that on your own car if you're doing something like this, because it means that all the lights are controlled through one fuse, and if that fuse goes, then you lose all of them. It shouldn't be a problem, really. So I've chosen to do it that way, but it does mean that, you know, if any of the lights do go to short, then it will trip a fuse rather than burning the car to the ground, which is nice. So yeah, that's the updated wiring diagram. Now it actually looks like there's more wiring, but that's the sort of trick of wiring diagrams. There's actually going to be quite a lot less wiring, because it's all going to be bound up in the fuse box and bus bar, because these two components are actually going to be contained within each other, and all the wiring's going to basically fly around inside and only go in and out where it needs to be. So it should actually be a lot tidier when it's done. There will also be some redundant wires, such as the old dynamo regulation wires and a couple of other things that I can remove from the wiring loom whilst I'm doing all this. So yeah, that's my fully amended wiring diagram. If you think it's good, do feel free to copy it. And so yeah, now that I've done my best to explain what I'm trying to do, we may as well get on with it. So the first thing I've got to do is figure out where the actual fuse box is going to go, and the space around here is pretty tight, as you can see. I mean, the old voltage regulator, that used to live around here, this area where you can see one of the holes where it used to screw into the bulkhead, but obviously that's now been taken up by the pedal box bracket. So what I've done is I think I've got it into just about the right place where it will fit, and I've duct taped it in position. And now if I just close the bonnet, it should, yeah, I think that fits just about fine. It doesn't hit the bonnet, it doesn't hit the crossbar bracing thingy, so that should work pretty well. So with the base of the fuse box now partially installed, what I need to do is figure out a good location for the bus bar. Now I've stripped the bus bar down, and it's going to fit, I think, just in there, although it is, as you can see, too long to fit in there. So I'm going to have to just trim down the ends of it, and then to mount it I'll simply drill a hole somewhere in the middle of the bus bar, and then that can drill straight through the car and bolt through in a similar manner to the fuse box, and that should fit nicely. Even doing electrical work, I still have to get my angle grinder out with this car. Okay, so I've modified the bus bar a fair bit actually. I've obviously shortened it at both ends so it now will fit in the gap in the fuse box, and then also I had to actually reconsider how the bolts are going to go through, because the original bus bar design uses obviously a bar to join all four of the terminals together, and actually I didn't want it like that. I wanted only 3 terminals when I wanted them to be separate. So obviously there'll be one for power, accessory, and then ignition. So what I've done is I have drilled 2 holes and then put through a pair of M6 bolts, which can then be used to mount it to the car, and then I've put another one of the bus bar terminals directly up through the middle, which hasn't left me a great deal of thread to work with, but it should be just about enough for my purposes. And now obviously the trouble is that this screw will then earth out on the body and cause all sorts of problems. So what I've done is I've cut a piece of silicon radiator hose and then put a couple of holes in it, and then that will simply slide over those 2 studs, and it will sit there and provide a nice sort of squishy base for the whole bus bar, and crucially it will really well insulate the bottom of this bolt from coming into contact with the metal of the car. So that should work nicely. It's not exactly concourse, but it should be nice and solid, so all I've got to do now is drill a couple of holes. And there we are now with the bus bar installed. So this will act as a hard point for the electrics to connect to, and then that will go between the second section of the fuse box, which will contain this module, and that will allow all the wiring to go in and out. One thing that I have now noticed is the fuse box is covering over one of my new heater holes that I made in the bulkhead. So that's no good. I'm going to have to make another one probably about here, but that's actually not too bad because that could be used to get wiring in and out with a grommet, that top hole, so all is not lost. But anyway, I'm going to remove the fuse box casing now, and then I'm actually going to get started with getting the wiring sorted out. Right, so the first wire we're going to tackle is the brown one that feeds the main power to the voltage regulator, which comes in at terminal A. So it's one of these brown ones, which then follows all the way down here and it goes here. So this is your main power feed for basically the whole car, and what it usually does on the factory setup is it plugs into the solenoid around here, I think, one of these two, so it will take its power directly from this point on the solenoid, which is then obviously connected directly to the positive terminal on the battery. Now what I did consider doing was linking this directly to the battery terminal like that, which would obviously shorten the wire massively, but I'm not sure that's really necessary. So since the wire's already here, what I'm going to do instead, instead of having a spade terminal, which I think is a little bit finicky, is I'm going to cut this off and I'm going to replace it with a ring terminal like what's on here, and then that can just bolt straight on there, which is a much stronger, more solid connection. And then that will be unplugged from the voltage regulator at the other end, and again I'll put another ring terminal on it, and that will join to this terminal here on the bus bar, which is going to be my permanent live terminal. Next wire is this brown wire with a blue tracer, which is the one that feeds the power originally from the voltage regulator straight to the ignition key. And this one has actually already had some work done in the past by someone. They've sort of extended it with this red wire, so I can actually cut that back because I don't need any of this length anymore. There we go. Right, that's the permanent wires done for a moment, just the two of them. So now I'm going to run a new wire, brand new wire, which will make up the accessory circuit. So I've installed this orange wire, since that's one of the only colours which isn't present in the loom. I've installed this orange wire into the loom, and it runs into the dashboard, and that will run up to the new ignition barrel for the accessory position. So I'm now going to join that to this middle terminal on the bus bar, which will be for the accessories. So with that done, I now need to join the wires that will go to this top post, which will be the ignition input. And those are these three white wires here. Now, one of these, in fact this one, the thick one, that comes from the ignition key. So when you turn the ignition key on, it will then energize this terminal, and then you have two other smaller wires here. One which feeds the ignition coil, and then one which feeds the fuel pump and comes out over here. and they will take ignition power directly from there. So now that I've relocated all the wires from the voltage regulator that are actually required to run the car, I can actually probably remove this, and you can see it's still got a couple of wires attached that are no longer needed. These are the old field and dynamo wires, which would originally have gone down here to the dynamo, but because the dynamo is not there, they're no longer needed. There is also an earthing wire that goes down here and ends in this ring terminal that is bolted onto the car's body. I can't get rid of it. It did used to plug into here to give the voltage regulator an earth point. I can't remove it because it's also connected to some stuff inside the car, so the earthing circuit is still needed. What I'll do is I'll just wrap up this in the wiring at the end, but for now I can actually now remove this old regulator. So now that all the connections have been made to the bus bar, I need to now do the ones that go from the bus bar to the fuse module so that the fuses can actually get power. So if we flip over the fuse module, you see that this is where you insert the terminals for the fuses, and I've decided to put the power in the middle here inside this shielded portion. And to make that work a bit more efficiently, I've bought the 10 input terminals, but they're all joined together in a little row. So this 5 is going to go on one side, and that will be a common input from the ignition side. So all 5 of these fuses will have ignition power. There will then be, on the other side, there will then be a set of 3, which will be probably, I'm not sure actually, either ignition or accessory, and then there's another 2, which again will either be ignition or accessory. I need to sort of decide which is going to be which. But then once those are just crimped on in the usual manner, they can then be inserted into the bottom of this, and they can be retrieved again if needs be. And then I have a little packet of individual terminals for the fuse outputs, and then the fuse outputs can then be attached to the rest of the circuitry that goes off to the car. There we go, so that's the input halves of the fuse box connected. So on the left hand side, those 5 are all going to be on the ignition circuit, and then on the other side I have the top 3 as the accessory circuit and the bottom 2 as permanent lives, and those have got 3 different wires corresponding to each one. So these 3 wires can now all plug into the bus bar. And talking of the bus bar, I've actually done a thing, and I've turned it round. It's now on the inside of the car, bolted through from the inside. So I've pushed the wiring all through inside the car, which has made it a lot tidier, and there's a lot more room for it to connect inside the car as well. And it means that there's a lot more space around here for the fuse box to connect. So all the wiring that needs to come in and out to the fuse box is going to come through this hole here, which I originally made for the heater hose, but will work really well for the fuse box, because the fuse box is going to sit just about here, so it's the perfect place for the wires to attach. So I've got some ring terminals crimped on there, but before I attach the fuse box to the bus bar, I'm going to crimp some output terminals for the fuse box onto the circuitry for the car. And the first ones I'm going to do are the 3 wires that control some things from the ignition side. So this green wire that controls the flasher unit, this green wire that I think controls the gauge cluster and things like that, and then this green wire that controls the brake lights. And I'm also going to include this new wire here, which is black with a green tracer, and that's going to connect into the standard 25 amp ignition fuse, and that's going to go down to this connector here, which is on the MX5 master cylinder. Now what this is, it's a simple float switch inside the reservoir, and when it gets too low, it turns a switch on, which then tells you which then turns a light on the dashboard telling you you've got low brake fluid. And since it's here, I figured I may as well wire it in with a simple wire that comes in, then it goes out the other way, and there'll just be a red light on the dashboard that comes on if the fluid gets too low. So it's an extra safety feature. Okay, I skipped ahead and I ended up wiring all the circuits into the fuse box. I mean, you can imagine what me endlessly stripping and crimping wires together looks like, but we've now got them all plugged in. So I've got the main wires plugged in on the ignition side, and then on the other side I've got these wires. That one's a little bit short, I could use some work. I've got these wires for the permanent live, and then another one here, this brown one, which is a permanent live for the lights. So now all the lights are going to have a fuse on them, not just the side lights, which will be a bit safer. And then here on the accessory, this grey wire is a cigarette lighter, which came with the car already, so I thought I may as well keep it, but actually wire it in properly with its own dedicated fuse. And then also on the ignition side, I've got this brown wire, which is going to go to the switch to run my new electric washer kit, which I'm going to wire in a moment. But before I do that, first thing I need to do is this inline fuse for the side lights from factory is now redundant because all the lights are fused. So I'm going to cut this out and then pull the wires back inside the car so they're a lot shorter, and then just join them together to eliminate that. Then I can get on with the washers. Okay, so that fuse has been eliminated, and all I did was expose the green, or the red wire with the green tracer inside inside the dashboard here, and then cut it off and remove the fuse holder entirely, and then just bullet connector it straight into the little splitter here for the light wiring. So that's now eliminated the side light fuse completely. Good. So the next thing I want to do here is install the electric washer kit. So the first thing you need to do is obviously remove the little pump that sits behind here to do that, and then you'll have a supply pipe, which I've just pulled out completely here. Supply pipe that comes from the old washer fluid reservoir, and that will come up all the way through the dashboard, and then will come up here, and then it will go into the pump, and then this green line here will then come out the other side of the pump with this little non-return valve on the end of it, and that will then go up inside there where it joins the washers on both sides. So all you do is you just bypass the old washer pump completely and connect your supply pipe directly to this one-way valve. And actually this clear plastic tube came with the kit, so I thought I may as well use it, as the old pipe was all nasty and sort of gone all hard and not very flexible anymore. Now, as for wiring, I've got the brown wire here going to one of the ignition fuses, and that then comes in here and it connects to this little momentary push switch which comes with the washer kit. So you just push it, so that comes in with a little mini spade, and then another mini spade going straight out on a blue wire. This blue wire then comes out of the bulkhead down here to the location where I'm going to put the new washer bottle, and then that has a small harness which comes with it with a little T-shaped connector which then plugs directly into the motor, and there's two wires on the end which you'll obviously need to solder in. So I'm going to solder on the blue to the supply wire, and then obviously you'll have the other one which will be the earth, which then just going to earth anywhere on the body. But because I've got it spare, I'm going to plug the earth into this old earth connector from the voltage regulator, and that'll be all nice and tidy, and then that can all just get wrapped up with the factory wiring, and that'll be that. And then of course you'll need to plug in the supply hose into the bottom of the motor here, and then also I'm going to be attaching the bracket. This comes with a little holding bracket. I'm going to be attaching it to these two holes here, and then that will just sit there, be held nice and securely, and then that's it. That's your electric washers converted. So at the beginning of the video I said that I was going to be converting the key barrel over to a new one that has an accessory position, and this is the key barrel that I'm going to be using. It's made by Durite, there's the part number, and this is very much like the original key barrel, except this one does have an accessory position. So if I just grab the key, then you can see that you can turn it. There's accessory, then there's ignition, and then start, and then of course when you let go it springs back to ignition. So then that's back to accessory and then off, and that's pretty good. This key barrel is actually meant for, I think, excavators and other machinery like that, but it's just about the perfect size to go in, well, almost perfect size to go in the hole there, and it won't look out of place either. And it just has simple spade terminals on the back, so you've got power in, and then accessory, ignition, and then start, I assume. So nice and easy, and it fixes in, we're using a threaded nut like that, goes back and forth, and you can also thread on and off the little bezel at the front, so you can get it in really nice and securely and tightly. The thread diameter is 22 millimeters, which unfortunately is too big to go into the factory hole here where the original key barrel goes. So I'm going to have to widen out this hole. Not a great deal, probably only about 3 mil or so, but yeah. So yet again, I'm going to be filing that out. Okay, I've filed out the hole a little bit, so that's now big enough to put the new ignition barrel through. And I've gone ahead and plugged in all the connections, which are, you know, exactly as they are on the original factory barrel, except for obviously the extra orange wire that I installed to power the accessory circuit. That's plugged into the first terminal. And then you've got, spin it over, you've got the white with a red tracer that goes on the start position, same as before. And then on the ignition circuit, I had to make a slight change because the original key barrel, if I show you, it has, on the ignition circuit, it has 2 spade terminals to connect to. And there are 2 wires that go to the ignition terminal, one for the rest of the ignition circuit, and then one that I think goes over to the fuel pump, which is over there. So because this only has 1 spade terminal, I had to modify it slightly with what's called a piggyback terminal. So I crimped that on the end, and it's what it is. It's a spade terminal, which then has a male spade terminal coming off the side of it, which is then what the other white wire is plugged onto. So that allows you to plug 2 wires onto 1 spade terminal, which is very useful. So that's now all plugged in correctly. So next thing to do is secure it in the hole, and there we go. It's fitted. It looks pretty good. It looks like it could be factory, and pretty easy to do. I found it easier to actually dial the nut in on the back of the key barrel and then tighten up the actual bezel on the front using a pair of mole grips with a cloth, just to prevent damage to the bezel. And yeah, it's held pretty securely. I mean, if you really, you know, grab it and move and try and twist it, it will rotate in the slot, but just for purposes of holding the key, it's fine. So key goes in, so there's accessory, then ignition, and then start. So yeah, that works pretty well. So there you go. Now I've got an accessory position for things like a radio and stuff in the future. And also today, while I've been in here, I fitted a new steering wheel. I like the old steering wheel, but with the seat all the way back in its new position, I found that I didn't really have enough. It was a bit far away for my arms to reach, whereas this steering wheel's got a lot more dish to it. This is an OMP wheel that I bought second hand, and then I dipped the spokes, which were anodized black. I dipped them in caustic soda, which made the anodizing come off, and then polished it with some metal polish, and yeah, it looks pretty smart, and it's got a lot more dish to it, so I can reach it a bit more easily. And I finished it off with a custom horn button with the new logo of the channel on it, which I had made for me on some gel badges. So yeah, that's another little addition to the car. So I think we're pretty much done in here. I've plugged in the battery, and I've given a function check of all the electrics, check that everything is working as it should be, which means I've now got actual fuses in my fuse box. A couple of the values are a bit off. I don't think these 15 amp ones need to be 15 amp. Those could probably be 10, but I can always change those later. So now I'm pretty much happy that actually all the work with the wiring is now done. So I'm now going to start the rather tedious process of re-wrapping all these wires in some nice new fabric tape. Okay, so I've jumped ahead a little bit and I've just finished up wrapping the loom, so it's all nicely tidied up, all wrapped in nice new fabric tape to keep it safe and well and everything. I've got some 2 high beam wires that I installed here for some new sort of fog lights that I'm going to be putting on, and up here I've got just a few wires coming out that need to connect to other things, like for the brake lights, because I'm now going to be using the switch underneath on the Marina pedal box. And I've got the fuse box bolted on nice and tightly. I was only able to use 3 bolt holes because that one's sort of not viable, but I can move the whole car by the fuse box, so I think that's probably going to be secure. Anyway, so at this point I'd say the wiring is pretty much done. We can roll on the next part of the project. Okay, well, you know, thanks for suffering through another one of my videos. But the next video should be a lot better, because now all the wiring's done, now all the tedious work is done. It's time to actually get a big lump of metal to fill that space with. Oh yes, it's time for the engine.